get going. So for Unit 6, we have, for the first lesson, we're going to be talking about frequency and histograms. Some of this might be familiar to you, so if it is, that is great. We have 3 vocabulary words for you. Frequency. A frequency is the number of data values in an interval. Okay, I'm not going to put an example for this one because we'll do one in the actual notes, but the word comes from the same kind of idea as how frequently does something happen. So the frequency of something is how many times does it happen, okay? If I were making a frequency table of boys and girls in this class, the frequency of girls would be just the number of girls that there are in this class. The frequency of boys would be the number of boys. Make sense? Okay. We can use frequencies to create a frequency table. So a frequency table is how we represent data when we're talking about the frequency or how many times that piece of data occurs. So a frequency table groups a set of data values into intervals and shows the frequency. For each interval. And we are going to do an example for this one. Okay. So in the example, we're going to make just a sample frequency table. A frequency table just looks like a T-chart. And on the left, we're going to put our intervals. So interval meaning that it's not always going to be just one set value. So let's say, for example, I want to make a frequency table of how many hours students study at nighttime or in a week. So on the left are going to be our intervals, and our intervals are going to be the hours. So let's say the first interval is going to be 0 to 2 hours. So then the second interval would be 3 to 4 hours a week. What would be the next interval? Good, 5 to 6. And then let's do one more, 7 to 8. Actually, and let's do 9 to 10. Okay. What do you notice about all of the intervals in our sample frequency table? What? One comes right after the next, so they're concurrent, meaning that we don't go 0 to 2 and then skip 4 to 5. So we have to include the 3 there. Are the intervals all the same size? 0 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, are those all the same size? Yeah. Well, 1 and 2 hours, 3 and 4 hours. We're getting technical here. Okay, so intervals, you want them to all be the same size, and you don't want any gaps. So we want to make sure that they occur right after the other. Okay, so then we would just count up how many students study within those intervals. So let's say 4 students study 2 to 4 hours a week. Or 0 to 2 hours a week. Let's say 6 students study 3 to 4 hours. let's say 6 students study 5 to 6 hours. 4 study 7 to 8 hours, and 3 study 9 to 10 hours a week. So then we would label that frequency. Okay. So on the left are your intervals, and you want to make sure that you identify the measure of the interval. The right is always going to be the frequency. How many people, how many data points fall into that interval, into that category. Okay? Not too bad? So then what we can do with our frequency table, we can take the information from our frequency table and represent it graphically on a histogram. So a histogram is just a graph that displays data from a frequency table. A histogram kind of looks like a bar graph. So remember back in the day in elementary school when you guys would make bar graphs? A histogram looks kind of like a bar graph, but it uses the information from our frequency table. So we are only looking at quadrant 1 here, so it's not like, it's more of like a chart. It's not something that we would necessarily have to do on graph paper. And along the bottom is going to be your intervals. So we're going to label that bottom. We're just going to use this frequency table at the top. So we're going to label it hours. And I know it's going to be kind of small, but this is just so that you get an idea of what it looks like on your vocabulary page. We're going to do actual examples in the notes. On this x-axis where we labeled it hours, we need to actually put our intervals. So we need to label a piece that goes from 0 to 2. Here, let me make it my writing thinner. From 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, and 9 to 10. Okay, I know that it's small. So just do the best that you can. And then along the y-axis is going to be our frequency. And usually for our frequencies, we are probably not going to label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so all the individual pieces, because a lot of times we're looking at data values that are bigger than that. So for this particular example, I'm just going to count by 2s. So I'm going to go 2, 4, 6, and you want to make sure that everything is evenly spaced, and it's only going to go up to 8. And then we make a bar graph representing the frequencies. So how many students studied 0 to 2 hours? 4 students. So you're on the 0 to 2 interval, we're going to make a bar graph that goes up to 4. And you color it in. Usually on a histogram, that first interval, the bar graph goes all the way to the axis. Okay, so you don't leave spaces in between. So on histograms, when we're making our graphs, you don't put spaces in between the bars. We just connect them all. Okay. How many students were on the 3 to 4 interval? 6. So we're going to do a bar that goes all the way up to 6. And that bar should be the same width as the 0 to 2 bar. Do your best. So all the widths of the bars should all be approximately the same width because our intervals are the same size. Okay? So you want to try and make it as close as possible. I know that on this one you guys are doing it really small. On your homework you'll be able to make it bigger. How many students were on the 5 to 6 interval? Also 6. What about 7 to 8? 4. And on the 8 to 9 interval, 3. So it's going to be halfway between the 2 and the 4. And usually when you are making these, you can see the, oh, that's too thick. So usually when you're making these, you will see the breaks. So it will look something like that. Okay, that's a histogram. And that's pretty much what we are doing for the rest of the notes. So we're going to be looking at data, and I'm going to have you guys make a couple histograms, but we're also going to be looking at what is called the shape of the histogram and what that tells us about the data. And then you also, on the test, on the quizzes, I'll forewarn you guys, I'm not going to be asking you on a test or a quiz to make a histogram, but I will give you one and ask you to give me information. So based off of this, if I asked you how many students studied between 3 and 6 hours, could you tell me? How many students studied 3 to 6 hours? 12 of them. 6 studied 3 to 4, and 6 more studied 5 to 6. So total that would be 12. Could you tell me how many total students there were? Yeah, you could add them all up, right? So that's going to be the kinds of questions that I'm going to ask you. So that's interpreting the data. Okay? So let's take a look at our first page of notes. So frequencies and histograms. We have 3 different types of shape that histograms can have. If the bars are roughly the same height, then the histogram is called uniform. Now, do they all have to be exactly the same height? No. So what I gave you on here is screenshots of a graphing calculator that created a histogram. If you notice, all of the bars are approximately the same height, but they're not all exactly the same height. But if they're approximately the same height, that is called uniform. If you can take a vertical line and divide the histogram into 2 parts that are close to mirror images. So I want you guys to underline close to mirror images. So not exactly a mirror, but pretty close. Then that histogram is called symmetric. Okay. So on this one, we would draw a vertical line right here. It does not have to be exactly in the middle. And if we folded it over, does it look pretty symmetric?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then we would call it symmetric. If the histogram is definitely not symmetric and has a peak that is not in the center, then it is called skewed. Okay? So we have uniform, symmetric, and skewed. So on each of these questions, after we make a histogram, I'm going to ask you to describe the shape. On a test, I might ask you to describe the shape of the histogram or why are words just escaping me? Oh, just is it uniform, symmetric, or skewed? Okay, and you have to be able to tell me why. Okay, it should be pretty obvious. Like I'm not ever going to try and trick you. So example 1, going to give you, I gave you a set of data. Together we're going to make a frequency table and a histogram, and then we're going to describe how the data looks. On the second problem, I'm going to have you guys do it on your own. So I give you all these pieces of data. The data below are the numbers of hours per week a group of students spend watching television. I want you to create a frequency table and then a histogram to represent the data. Are all of these data pieces in order? No. So one thing that I would suggest that you do, especially when I do not give you the intervals, is to put them all in order and see if you can make your own intervals that are even. So on this one, I give you the intervals 0 to 5, 6 to 11, 12 to 17, and 18 to 23. Notice that they are all the same size, so you want to always make sure your intervals are the same size. So what we're going to do is count up all of the ones that are between 0 and 5. So let's take a look. Every time we go down the list, I'm going to count how many are between 0 and 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the frequency of students, 6, thank you, that watch between 0 and 5 hours of TV is 6. That one got cut off on my screen. 6 to 11. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 12 to 17. 1, 2, 3. And 18 to 23, we had just 1. Okay. So even though my biggest number was not 23, my biggest number was 22, when I made the intervals, I had to put it to 23 to make sure they were all even. Does that make sense? So if I had only put 18 to 22, the interval wouldn't be the same size. So we have to make sure they're the same size. Everybody okay with making the frequency table? Okay, so we're going to create a histogram based off of this information. A couple of things that I want you guys to be aware of. First, I labeled my histogram, watching television. So anytime, especially in this unit, we're going to be making a lot of charts, a lot of tables, a lot of graphic representations of data. You must label it. Okay, so you cannot assume that I know what these numbers mean. So if you did not have this at all, and you just put the bars, if I was looking at this, I would not know what the heck those bars represented. Okay? So we have to label it watching television. The frequency is on the left. We're looking at our interval on the bottom, which are the hours. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals. So we're going to make one from 0 to 5. And I'm going to have it end about right there. And then I can have this one here. Ooh, those aren't going to be even. 4 intervals, right? Okay. So try and make them about even. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4. The next interval is 6 to 11. 12 to 17. And 18 to 23. So we just label it. So this line represents 0. This line represents 5, right? Right next to it is 6, and here's 11. And then next to it is 12, 17, and then the end is 23. Okay? So then we're going to make our histogram. How many students were in the 0 to 5 interval? 6. And I think I'm going to do 2, 4, 6. Does that sound good? So we need to label our scale. I think on both of the ones I give you like the lines. But when you're making your own, you're going to have to come up with your own. Okay? So on the 0 to 5, we had 6. So I'm going to draw a bar all the way to 6. Your coloring in does not have to be perfect. How many students from 6 to 11? 5. So that's halfway between 4 and 6. If you want to use like the side of a binder, your planner, to make straight lines, you can. That's great. 3 students in the 12 to 17. And 1 student, here, in the 18 to 23 interval. Okay? So then my last question is this data uniform, symmetric, or skewed? Uniform means about the same across the whole way. Does this look about the same across the whole way? No. Symmetric means we can fold it in half and it's about the same. So if I were to fold it in half, does this look symmetric? No. Skewed means that the peak is somewhere besides the center. Is this one skewed? Yes. So we would answer the question, the data is skewed. In statistics, there is a lot of writing having to explain how you got what you got. Right now, the only thing I'm asking is that you tell me what the shape is, okay? As we go further on, I'll ask for more explanation, but right now you're just telling me the shape in a complete sentence. Okay? Not too bad? That's kind of all we're doing today, so I have a second problem for you. The data below are the points scored per game on a pinball machine. I want you to create a frequency table and histogram to represent the data. So here are the points, but I do not give you the intervals. So you guys need to figure out the intervals yourself. I do want you to split it into 4 intervals, so I did help you out in that respect. On your homework, it's not going to tell you how many intervals to split it in. So some of your histograms might look slightly different than the person next to you. That's okay. For this purpose, I told you I want you to split it into 4 intervals. You do not always have to use 4. Okay? But you're going to have to create your own intervals. So my suggestion is to reorder the data from smallest to biggest so that you can kind of see where my smallest number is and where my biggest number is and split that into 4ths. So if my smallest number is 2 and my biggest number is 33, that's a difference of 31, right? Half of 31 is like 15 and a half. And half of 15 and a half is 7 and a quarter. 7 and 3/4. Yeah. So we want each interval to be approximately 7 and 3/4 big. So I'm going to round that down to 7. So if I'm starting at 2, what would I have to go to so that I have 7 numbers in there? 9. 2 to 9. And then I could go from 10 to 17. And then 18 to 25. 18 plus 7 is 25. And then 26 to 33. Okay. As I was walking around, I saw some of you just did 0 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, 31 to 40. That's also fine. This is a little more exact, but if you're having real struggles, that's okay. But you don't want to make it, my only caution with doing that is 40 is so much bigger than the largest number that having your interview, well, if you're starting at 0, but your smallest number is 2, that's only 2 off. But if your biggest number is 33 and you're going all the way to 40, now that's 7 off, which in my intervals is an entire interval. So you just want to be careful that you're not going too far under or over on your biggest and smallest values, because that could throw your intervals and your frequencies off. So try your best to break it up so that you're as close to the smallest and the biggest number as possible. Sometimes that means you're going to have 5 intervals. That's okay. Usually we want 4 or 5 intervals, not usually any less than 4. Okay? So some of yours might look slightly different from mine, but that's okay. I'm going to go off of this one. So from 2 to 9, how many students were in the 2 to 9? 4. How many students were in the 10 to 17? 8. What about the 18 to 25? And then 26 to 33? 1. So when you are making your histogram, I already labeled it points per game, not pointers per game. Yeah, change that to an S. Points per game. I want you to label the intervals and the frequency. So our intervals are in terms of points, right? So we're going to label it points. This upper side should be frequency. I am splitting it into 4, so I know it's going to look like this. I don't know. And then fill in your frequency or your interval. So 2 to 9, 10 to 17, 18 to 25, and 26 to 33. And we want it to go, our biggest one is 8. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. Did you guys go by 2s?
Yeah.
Okay. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So that's a little higher than we need to go, but it's really going to be okay. So when we fill this out, in the 2 to 9, we had 4, so that's going to go to here. In the 10 to 17, we had 8. Oops. So that's going to go here. Fill it in. 18 to 25, we had 5. So that's halfway. I tried to make these the same size. And then we only had 1 here. So guys, looking at your histogram, does that look uniform, symmetric, or skewed?
Skewed, I guess.
Is there like a really obvious peak all the way to the one side or the other side?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Are you positive?
Okay, well, on mine there is.
That's why I'm saying you have to make your intervals even. So here, I would say this is actually symmetric, personally, because if I were to cut it in half, I have a low, a high, a not as high, and then a low. So if I were to take my pencil and kind of make a curve over it, it makes a pretty even looking curve. Okay? On the previous one, so I'm going to go, oh, I can't go back. If it were skewed, we would have to have either a really high or really low peak all the way to the right or all the way to the left. But usually if it's low and then high and then low again, that's going to be symmetric. So we're going to call this one symmetric. So just so you guys are aware, with data, it's never going to come out perfectly uniform, perfectly symmetric. So you can't just always say that it's skewed. Okay, we just want to look at the overall general shape. So in my opinion, the overall general shape is pretty symmetric. It's low, high, and then goes back to low. Okay? The previous one was obviously skewed because it was super high on the left and then just got lower. Does that make sense? Okay.